If you have questions, you can ask them both in Hebrew or in English in the Zoom chat. Our speakers know that you're going to ask questions and expect them, and they save time in the end of their lectures in order to answer them. So, what is Tel Avir? We are a central resource in English for anyone interested in environmental issues in Israel. We started in 2016, and tonight it's our 28th event. We're also a community with more than 1,300 members on Facebook, and recently we became an official Israeli NGO with Olim and Israeli leaders. We have many plans to expand with field trips, more classes, job platforms, newsletters. So if you care about these issues, you are more than welcome to come and join us. And if you want to know more about Tel Avir and see our past events, you can do it in our website in the link below. So let's start and meet our lectures this evening. First to speak is Dr. Maya Negev. Maya Negev is a faculty member in the School of Public Health in the University of Haifa. She is going to talk about the environmental implications of the coronavirus from a public health perspective. After her, Dr. Ram Fishman is going to talk, and Dr. Fishman is a lecturer in the Department of Public Policy in Tel Aviv University and the director of the Nitzan Lab. He is going to talk about the short-term versus long-term implications of the coronavirus on the environment from an economic and social outlook. Lastly, before we begin, I want to thank both of our speakers for joining us this evening and taking their time to talk about these important issues. Maya, I'm giving you the stage.
What do corona and climate change have in common, and how should preparedness and response be perhaps mutual and with co-benefits? So we will focus on three aspects. The first will be pollution. The third, the corona crisis. Obviously, this is a huge public health crisis that no one wanted, and we would rather, not have. But at the same time, it's a very interesting natural experiment that is taking place, and we can also think from it for other crises. So right now on the screen, you can see the NO2 levels in China in January 2020 and February. And obviously, there is a decline due to the halt of transportation, travel, and industry because of the corona. And we actually see a great picture from public health perspective, because
Maya, I'm just stopping your video because I think it's slowing it down a little. Okay.
Should I? Oh, okay.
Yeah.
Got you. And in Israel, as some of you may have seen, we can see on the top row jumps of 3 weeks in the air pollution with an improvement towards the end of, towards March. And in the bottom, just March, week by week, and we can see that the week of the 8th of March, there was Purim with a lot of social gatherings and activities. And then with the closure that started in mid-March, we see a huge drop. And the answer to the poll, most of you were right, is about 40% decrease in NO2 emissions comparing to last year's levels. And this is data from NASA satellites. Let's go back to where we were. I was saying that air pollution dropped dramatically, and this is big news for public health. And new research, new study shows, as you can see on the screen, an estimated 77,000 lives saved in China due to the drop in air pollution. In China, there is massive mortality with some estimations of about 1 million per year from air pollution alone. And of course, we would not want the corona to occur, but right now, actually today, when we see a 70,000 death toll from corona worldwide, at least it's, you know, a little bit of good news that similar numbers have been saved in China so far. I'm just hoping that the corona death toll will not go up much. Obviously, this is a short-term good news because air pollution is going to go up, and that is what you will see in the video when you watch it, that China is going back to normal and air pollution will go up. So it's like a window of opportunities from a public health air pollution perspective that is already closing in China. So 70,000 seems to be a death toll that is repeated here for the third time. We said that this is the corona death toll, and we said that this is pretty much the number of lives saved in China according to an initial estimate. And here you can see the death toll from a mega heat wave. So now we are kind of jumping into climate change, where 17 years ago in Western Europe, so the most developed countries in the world, a massive heat wave hit with temperatures about 40 degrees Celsius, and 70,000 people were killed as a consequence. The same risk populations, by the way, mainly the elderly and the chronically ill. So this is a worry, particularly in light of the WHO, the World Health Organization's forecasts that due to climate change, about 250,000 additional people are going to die every year. And I guess that for us and environmentalists, this is the big question of how comes we can't get attention to climate change as much as we can for corona. And we'll talk about it more this evening. But now I want to move on to my second point, which is One Health. One Health is an approach that emphasizes that in order to have healthy people, we need also healthy environment and healthy animals. So we all know that it is estimated that corona was transmitted to human beings from bats, from wildlife. And we see this trend also increasing in light of climate change, and this is the link. So you can see here some factors that intensify the connection between people and animals. We think that we are getting away from nature and into cities, but actually what we see is that nature is not getting out of us, which is of course in ways great. And we see now some wild animals coming back to cities, even in Eilat and all over the world. You all saw the pictures of wildlife going back to the empty cities. But in our normal reality, with the population growth, the urbanization and the deforestation, a lot of wildlife is becoming in more contact with people, and more diseases can be transmitted this way, both ways, by the way. Also, man can infect wildlife, and especially, for example, chimpanzees, etc. These trends are going to also intensify with climate change, because many of the vectors that transmit diseases, such as mosquitoes, they like hot temperature and humidity, and they thrive. So we see a rise in malaria, chikungunya, and leishmania also in Israel, for example, not malaria, but leishmania, West Nile fever, due to climate change. Wildfires and the impact of climate change on water resources also put more stress on the environment and on our life in the ecosystem. So Corona is a message for us to think about human as a part of the ecosystem and how we should all interact in more sustainable ways. So this is, Corona is really interesting time for public health researchers, because in normal days, nobody is talking about epidemiology. Most people don't even know what it is. And right now, everybody is looking at graphs of diseases and all the time and try to figure out, epidemiological investigations. So this slide is kind of 101, the most basic idea in infectious diseases in epidemiology, the epidemiological triangle. In order for diseases to be transmitted, we need an agent such as the coronavirus. We need a host, and we need an environment that is suitable, for example, temperature. So we're right now hoping that a hotter and drier environment in summer will be less suitable for corona, and we'll see a decline also due to seasonality. But definitely all of these three interact, and this is very much true for climate change as well. As I said, some of the hosts, such as mosquitoes, thrive in hotter climate, and also waterborne, foodborne diseases are sensitive to climate, and of course airborne diseases maybe too. So again, the more holistic environmental approach is emphasized in the corona and also important for climate change. You can see here the predictions for rising temperature in Middle East. So the Middle East is already 1.5 degrees higher temperature than without anthropogenic intervention and of greenhouse gas emissions. This is a hotspot for climate change. It's getting hotter and drier here comparing to the rest of the world. And it's expected that this trend will continue with a much hotter temperature, longer and stronger heat waves, which will, increase, for example, mortality during the short time spans of 1 week or 2 weeks. And from public health or health systems perspective, we can see here how Corona kind of prepares us also for climate emergencies, because we need that health systems more and more need to be prepared for periods with a great increase in morbidity. So just to summarize, Corona is not yet been linked to climate change, but this kind of viruses and diseases may rise due to climate change as well. The third point, I'm just going to make sure if you guys are with me, anybody say something on chat, so I know that I'm not talking to myself. Anybody here? Yeah, hi Owen, thanks. Sorry about the drawing on the screen. It may be my little kid messing up with the screen in a different room. So you go about working from home. I don't know if you guys can see it, or only me, but Uri, stop. Okay, so moving on to my third and last point, the Middle East perspective. Israel is a very small country surrounded by several neighbors. With some of them we have good relations, with others we don't. Corona shows us that public health has to be tackled at the regional and at the global level. So for people who may be familiar with the Arva Institute for Environmental Studies, and those of you who don't, look it up, the motto is that the environment knows no borders. air pollution know no borders, and it's now very clear that infectious diseases also know no borders. We see it with the corona spreading in 1 week all over the globe, and we also see it in our region, for example, across borders that, you know, for example, between Israel and the Palestinian authorities, hundreds of thousands of people cross every day, both ways. And we already know now that the virus is being transmitted across populations, and that nations have to collaborate in order to prevent transmissions. So I'm just going to, before I move on to the next slide and give another focus on that, also say that the main recommendations to prevent corona right now are wash your hands and physical distance, right? But in an area like the Middle East, some people don't have access to running water and they can't wash their hands as recommended. Also in Israel, for example, the Bedouin unrecognized villages population, they don't have running water and can't follow this recommendation. So of course, if kind of pocket populations at risk are places where corona will be transmitted more easily, it will affect the whole region. So we have to care about everybody. It kind of emphasizes the solidarity and the vulnerability of some groups. Also, socially, we are populated countries, and we have social culture of a lot of touching and hugging, and it's more difficult for us to keep social distance, and this is also a cross-border challenge. So here is a quote that I like from a great researcher at Harvard. She said that the only way we can overcome corona is sorry, I can't see the beginning of the quote, but you can all see it, right? So overcoming it is set by the weakest healthcare systems globally. So not one country can survive it on its own. And we see here the hospital beds in the OECD region. This is the average. We see that Israel is much below the average of hospital beds per 1,000 people. And of course, the conditions in our neighboring countries are worse. The rates are often worse. And again, this is a message at the regional level for public health. Right now, the ministries of health, for example, between Israel and the Palestinian Authority, are collaborating, especially regarding corona tests and laboratories. But this is done very informally, low-key, and this is an example for where we can, you know, tap on the need to collaborate for everybody's public health, and apply that to climate change as well. So just to finish up, health, according to the WHO, is a state of complete physical, mental, and social well-being, not merely the absence of disease or infirmity. This is a very old definition, but it's still sound. To fight the corona, we have to practice physical distances. We have to act to get to the absence of disease. But we cannot do that while neglecting other physical, mental, and social aspects of health, because we don't want long-term negative health impacts. And again, this is something that is relevant to all. Finally, you can all see the photo. It speaks for itself. I'll let you read it. So finally, I guess all environmentalists all over the world are asking themselves, how comes COVID-19, which is the disease caused by the coronavirus, got so much attention while we are trying to achieve exactly the same things for years? And of course, Corona is a bad thing. It's not something that we wanted in order to change habits, and it's also not likely to change habits for long. Old habits die hard. But our take-home message is right now, the big $1 trillion for the environment question is, how can we tap on the changes that we were forced to make and take this as an opportunity to also improve health and climate in the long run. So I'm done. I'm happy to answer any questions. Please chat or talk. I'm here. I'll give it another minute before I turn it over to Ram. And I'm really looking forward to hear your talk, Ram.
So, hey Maya, thank you so much for your lecture. I see that a few people did ask questions in the chat. I see at least 2 recent questions.
Okay, so are there examples from past infectious diseases on the environment? I'm not sure if I completely understand the question. Maybe you can rephrase it. I'll move on to the next one by Mike. Isn't the biggest opportunity going to be directing stimulus money from governments towards sustainable energy systems? Well, towards sustainable policy in general, energy and otherwise, including, sustainable transportation, for example. Obviously, from a public health perspective, we also have an opportunity for preparing the public and at the local and regional level towards more resilient lifestyle, because climate change is going to impact us in many kinds of emergencies. And this is an opportunity, again, to kick out old habits also at the individual, community, and local level, and to adapt to, the world is changing a bit, to adapt to changes in a good way. From a health systems perspective, Israel has a good health system, but it's thriving for more resources. And we saw that our rates of beds and also physicians and nurses per person are lower than they should be. And this is also important for climate change. So again, there are many, many opportunities here from a health perspective. Another question. If there is a significant economic recession, how can we convince politicians to force on sustain? Okay. Yeah, absolutely, Ari, you're right. This is what I call the $1 trillion question from a climate perspective. Yeah, this is money time for us to convince politicians that stimulus programs that will harm the environment will harm public health in the long run and will cause a higher death toll than the corona. How do we do that? That's the big question that we should all be thinking about. Is there a real direction forming from the morning after? That's a good question. There is some talk about an exit program from the emergency, but leveraged change, I haven't seen on the government level yet. It will be also interesting to follow this up on the private sector level, because many companies, for example, that move to long distance conference calls, move to allowing work from home partially. Many people in many jobs, it's important to also go to work, but if we just do it 4 days a week and work 1 day a week from home, it would be great for air pollution, for example, and for other well-being aspects. So I think that even some environmental NGOs in Israel are notorious for not allowing work from home. And perhaps if civil society and private sector and governments just do this, it will already be an improvement. And of course, there's many, many other mechanisms that we want to see being adopted. Okay, thank you so much, everybody. You can feel free to ask me any questions by chat. I'm going to be here after and answer everything. I'm also going to send the PowerPoint to Oren and Amir to distribute. And I would like to move on to Dr. Ram Fishman now. I also look forward to hearing this talk and to giving the wider picture from a social and economic perspective. So Ram, over to you.
Yes, so thank you so much again, Maya. And everyone will also share this presentation in our website and in the event link. So it will be easy, very easy for you to find it. Ram, can we move to you? Can you hear us?
I'll just share my slide and go to play mode. Okay, so hi everybody. Thanks, Maya, that was fascinating. Thanks the organizers. It's so good to hear about this organization. It's so inspiring. I want to talk to you about, to continue on what Maya discussed and talk to you about, from an economics and policy and political point of view, should we be optimistic that the coronavirus will save the climate, or is it more likely that it's going to kill the climate? The whole climate discussion is very complicated, but I think there is one kind of a simple statistics which can help us keep in mind where we are at with regards to the climate crisis. And that number is that this idea of a carbon budget. The carbon budget is the amount of carbon that humanity can put into the atmosphere before we lose hope of maintaining the change in the climate to below 1.5 degrees centigrade. Okay, so there's a certain amount, it's an approximation, it doesn't exactly work like this, but it gives you a good benchmark to say that if there's a certain amount of carbon we can put in the atmosphere before we lose hope of stabilizing the climate below 1.5. Why 1.5 degrees? Many scientists feel that once you cross 1.5 degrees, there's going to be a real shift in the risk of catastrophic events and a real shift in the severity of the impacts. Some people talk about 2 degrees, some around 1.5 degrees. And the world has agreed that we are going to limit to 2 degrees, preferably 1.5 degrees. So that's kind of where we are trying to reach. And out of that amount of carbon that can be released to the atmosphere before we cross that threshold and lose that hope, you can see in this bucket that we have already exhausted most of it. You can see here a division by countries, but what's more important, that gray area in the top is what is left before we reach that amount of carbon. And at the rate of the emissions right now, that means we have 10 years before we cross that line. So that's a very scary idea to understand, because 10 years is nothing. 10 years basically mean to achieve such a radical transformation of the energy system is nothing. So we're really at the last second of this race. Another way to think about it is by 2050, we have to reach 0 emissions, okay? We have to reduce emissions so drastically that by 2050 or so, we have to reach 0 emission, 0 use of fossil fuels. That is a very daunting challenge. Now, of course, the coronavirus pandemic has raised hope, like Maya described to us. There's already a big decline in air pollution and in CO2 emissions. And so that raised hope with some people that maybe this can allow us to save, to gain some more time, maybe to shift things around and save the climate issue. But I think those hopes are very much exaggerated. If you look historically, and on the left-hand side, you can see a graph. The black dots line is basically its carbon emissions, CO2 emissions, starting from 1960. And there has been a number of big events on the world stage that have reduced emissions, like the oil crisis in the 70s, economic crisis in the US, the collapse of the Soviet Union. Then we had the Asian financial crisis. Each one of them have led to some reduction in the long-term emission trajectory. But if you look at the Asian financial crisis in '97, and if you look at the 2008 global financial crisis, which is a severe crisis, and you can see a blow-up of that on the right-hand side, emissions did not really budge that much. In 2008, that was the year of the crisis, they went down by less than 2%. And 1 year afterward, they already bounced back to the original trajectory by 5% and remain on the seats going back to the original trajectory. So what that means is that every time there is an economic recession like we are having right now, and it may stay with us for a while, definitely because economic activity declines, greenhouse gas emissions reduce. But this is a very short-term thing. Once the economy starts to pick up, when the recession starts to wind down, emissions will go back up, and they'll go back up rapidly, and it's not even clear there'll be any long-term effect of that. So from that point of view, hoping that the recession will save the climate, I think there's very little hope there. I think it's the opposite. First of all, the amount of reduction in greenhouse gas emission, they're not going to go above 5% unless the crisis is so severe and becomes a real catastrophe. So a most generous estimate, if they go by 5%, and I don't mean these first 2 weeks, but in, over a year, okay? They'll rebound quickly, as we just saw. And like somebody asked just at the end, there is research, there's a lot of evidence when economic times are hard, when there's economic hardship, that environmental policy is pushed aside. It's not on the minds of people, and it's not on the minds of politicians. And we have evidence from that from the past. So as long as we are in this recession, economic policy is not going to be strict. It's not going to be pushed forward. And there's also going to be much less investment in the economy, including in renewable energy companies. Many renewable energy companies are much more sensitive and vulnerable to reduction in investment in the fossil fuel industry. So that will put them at a disadvantage and actually can have negative impacts for the future if many of these companies go under. And not to mention that this kind of reduction in emissions is not what we want, because it's a reduction in emission that comes with a huge amount of human suffering. That is not sustainable. That kind of economic crisis also usually helps populist politicians to get elected, and those kind of politicians are usually anti-environmental policy, anti-international cooperation. So all I see in this recession, in terms of the climate, is bad news. Another point to think about is, even if we do reduce emissions by 5% for the next 5 years, let's say if the recession lasts for 5 years, 5% over 5 years means a quarter of a year's worth of emission, right? Remember, we have 10 years to act. So that only gives us a quarter of a year more. And if there's no environmental policy enacted during those 5 years, we lose 5 years. We cannot lose 5 years now just to gain a quarter of a year. I hope you get the point. It's a disaster, I think, from a climate change policy level. But maybe from a more deeper perspective, maybe there's an opportunity here, and this is the cover from The Guardian recently, basically saying we can't go back to normal. How would coronavirus change the world? There's this idea that maybe this very unique experience that we are all going through as individuals and as a society is going to somehow trigger some kind of a deeper change within us. And that is going to be somehow manifested in the way we treat the climate. And that can happen through a few channels. One is as individuals, and Maya mentioned that as individuals, we might decide to change our lifestyle, our lifestyle choices, our consumption choices. Or maybe the private sector, companies, businesses may also undergo this kind of a mental shift. Or it could be that governments are going to go through some change and are going to somehow utilize the crisis or learn something from the crisis. So let me discuss every one of those possibilities really quickly. So with regard to lifestyle choice, this is something that for me personally is like always been a dilemma, because I also try, like I'm sure many of you try, to do something in our lives that to minimize our environmental impact. You know, I'm very proud that I don't have a car and I'm vegetarian, and I'm sure many of you do much more than that. I ruin that because I fly a lot. But the point is, we all care so much about it that we try to, you know, we make a lot of effort internally and emotionally in our lives to reduce our environmental footprint. Is it likely that a sufficient number of people in the world are going to go through such a deep psychological change or mindset change that they will really make such a drastic reduction in their lifestyle? I think that's a very, very unlikely scenario. First of all, we all know, you know, classically, it's like a routine thing that we go through some crisis in our life, and then we swear to ourselves, when I go back, when I feel better or whatever it is, I'm not gonna get up late, I'm gonna behave better, I'm gonna live better. Most of the time, we don't do it. And most of the people in the world, I do not think it's even going to be on their radar. I think the system, our economic system, our cultural system is very powerful, and it's not going to give any chance for that to happen. And I know that many of us put a lot of importance in the environmental movement about our personal lives, but I actually have come to the conclusion that that is actually a dangerous idea, because it makes people think that the way to solve the environmental crisis is to change something in my life. You know, for a lot of people, you know, they think that they have to stop eating meat. It's very hard for people to do that. Or I'm going to turn off the light a little more. Those things can mean something, but they take a large emotional investment from us. And the overall impact they have on greenhouse gas emissions in the world, even under very, very optimistic scenarios, is very small. And so I have a feeling, and I know many people will not agree with that it's a dangerous idea almost. The only way to achieve real change, because remember, we have to go to zero emissions. Cutting emissions by 10% is going to take a huge emotional and effort from people all over the world, but 10% is not going to even close to cut it. So the only way to achieve a real fundamental structural change is through politics or through the economy, through policy. This is like, you know, if the Iranian army tomorrow started marching towards here, that the equivalent would be that any one of us would say, come on, grab a stick, grab a stone, let's go and volunteer and see how we can stop them. This is why we have an army. This is why we have a government. We have to deal with this through government and policy at the global and country level. So I'm not very optimistic about those kind of lifestyle choices. Even if we do fly one flight less and have do more of our work or home, I don't think it's going to even come close to doing what is needed. And certainly people in emerging economies are not going to be interested in that as they just come out of poverty. So I don't put a lot of faith in that. What can government, and the same goes, by the way, for private business. What about governments? I think one of the questions was about the possibility that governments will utilize this opportunity to change something drastic. And actually, there are precedents for that. During the 2008 economic crisis, the global financial crisis, Obama actually used the fact that the car industry in the US was in deep trouble. They needed a big bailout. Obama agreed to give them a bailout, but used that moment when their political power was lower, when they needed something from the government. Their lobbies, their political power was much lower than usual, and he used that moment to force upon them, to get them to agree to a deal which will really dramatically improve fuel efficiency standards for the American car fleet. That's a big deal in terms of emissions. It's actually also good for the economy because it saves fuel, it saves money. But he was able to use the opportunity to do that. Unfortunately, from a climate perspective, at least, there's a different president in the White House right now. That president actually is trying to undo that Obama's fuel efficiency legislation. And there was discussion now, actually, as part of this stimulus package for this crisis, there was the Democrats wanted to use it to give stimuli to the renewable energy industry. The Republicans wanted to use it to give stimulus to the fossil fuel industry. And eventually they agreed, and the compromise was to support neither of the two. So it could be worse, but it's certainly not what we would have hoped that governments would do to utilize this crisis. I don't know, maybe in Israel there's still hope, but I don't get the impression it's really on the agenda to use that. So that's a bit of a wasted opportunity. What about the more profound change? I think maybe there is some hope there, because I think both people and politicians, policymakers, will remember a few things from this corona crisis that carry over. First of all, for those who don't trust scientists, I think many people will now remember that when scientists tell you that there's something invisible in the air, which is heading towards you, and their mathematical models are telling them that it's going to grow and hit you at a particular time, you better believe them, because it actually happens in the end. Those predictions fulfill themselves. So I hope that maybe for those who don't take science so seriously, maybe there can be a little bit of a mind shift there. That could be a little bit naive. Maybe another lesson, although this is a very different time scale, that policymakers will learn that if you delay action beyond the point that scientists tell you have to act, scientists say you act now, even though you see nothing now, this is the time to act. If you delay past that point in order to reduce economic damages, you're going to pay with interest. You're going to have to be much stricter later. There's going to be a heavy cost associated with that. In the case of the climate, the longer we wait, it's going to be more damaging, more expensive. The costs are going to be more severe. So maybe some of that will stay with the policymakers. Again, I might be naive, but I can hope that the time scale, again, is a problem because it's different. It's not something happening today. It's happening further into the future. Another point is, when we have a lot of uncertainty about the magnitude of the damages, we are seeing right now that all politicians, including Trump, and eventually including Boris Johnson, are assuming the worst. That it is possible that the infection rate, that the death rate of the coronavirus is actually not that high. We don't know. And if it's really low, then maybe it doesn't justify this economic crisis. But politicians go and they act based on the assumption of the worst scenario. And we have a similar situation when it comes to the climate crisis. We cannot predict exactly what the damages are going to be. But maybe if we learn from this, we should really assume the worst case scenario. Also, people are showing now very widely, and including public opinion polls, even across, people who are in the right side of the economic spectrum, that we should accept economic damage to save lives. And like Maya said, the climate change is going to kill a lot of people. Air pollution is killing a lot of people. So maybe some of that will carry over. Maybe. There's a big question mark there as well. But I want to end on a more optimistic note, because I think there is one maybe arena where some opportunity exists. And that has to do with the divestment movement around climate change. So this is a picture of a recent protest, like in January, that was starting to led by some prominent climate activists in the US. Basically, they started to look at what banks are doing with their money. And they found out that some banks are investing heavily in the fossil fuel industry. And one of the main, it turns out that Chase is the main bank that is financing the fossil fuel industry. And these activists are like, what the hell? You're using our money is being used to support the fossil fuel industry. And they started protesting against these financial institutions. I was actually supposed to be in the US now. I lived a long time in the US. I still have a little bit of money in Chase. And I was planning, when I went to the US right now, to close my account and move it to another bank, which is less polluting. So I can't do this for now, but it turns out, and they make the case, that the fossil fuel industry really depends on a lot of these investments. So there's a way for us as individuals, without having to make drastic changes in our lifestyle, to very easily put pressure on the fossil fuel industry. In fact, there was a big breakthrough in this movement, again, just like a month or two ago, where BlackRock, which is the world's probably largest investor, has decided, and this is in response to pressure from their own customers, to change their portfolio and direct it more into environmentally and climate-friendly investment. That is a huge investor, and this can start to have serious impacts on the fossil fuel industry. They cannot survive without access to the finance they need. So again, we as investors, as people who put their money in the banks, if we start to put pressure around that, that's a way that each of us can have an impact, which is much bigger than how much electricity we consume at home or how far we drive in our car. And I think maybe there's a moment here, a particular opportunity for that kind of approach. Why? First of all, because of the financial crisis, a lot of capital has moved out of the stock market into safer investments. When the economy starts to pick up, a lot of that capital is going to go back into the stock market, into other investments. We have to make sure it doesn't go back to those same places. We have to make sure it goes into much climate-friendlier channels. How do we do that? We have to tell our investors, our pension funds, our banks, that we don't want our money to be invested in fossil fuel industry. That doesn't have to bear a large cost from us, because right now there are many investment opportunities and funds that are climate friendly, environmentally friendly, and still carry good returns. And you know, us, we are younger generation, most of the capital is not with us. It's with our parents, maybe with our grandparents. That's where most of the capital is. We also have a moment now where there's been an interesting dynamic between generations. It may not be nice to say it, but it is true that right now, the younger generation is taking a big hit economically for the sake of the older generation, which is the most vulnerable to this disease. I'm not saying that's the wrong thing to do. I think it's the right thing to do. But it exposes a certain dynamic between generations where one generation gives to support the older generation. This older generation has failed the younger generation in terms of climate. It's leaving the younger generation a messed up planet. It's not because they don't love their children. Individually, everybody loves their children and will do everything for them. But as a collective, as a generation, they are failing and they are leaving us with a messed up planet. This is a time to go and tell them, we have shown intergenerational solidarity, and now it's time for you to do it back. And you should take your capital and stop using your money to finance the fossil fuel industry that is messing up our future. So from those perspectives, I think maybe there is a moment here. Maybe we can mobilize a movement that will get all of us to go and press our parents and our friends and ourselves to press our banks and our investors and the funds we invest in to find for us an environmentally friendly, profitable, but environmentally friendly investment channel. And that, if enough of us do it, and again, it doesn't take much from us, we can start diversing more and more finance from the fossil fuel industry, which can have a bigger impact per person than working hard in our lives. We should also make any effort in our personal lives, of course, to reduce our environmental impact, but that is not going to cut it. And we should start thinking about something more collective. I'm sorry I missed all your questions because I was in full screen, so now I can hopefully see them. Diana, I also see the risk that Israel will rather push economic growth and unstable innovation after the crisis. How could we counteract? So I think one way to counteract is politically. We have to make our politicians aware that we care about this. They will act only if they feel their voters care about this. And the other way, I think, is the divestment as well. Yeah, I think bringing health into the climate change is very good. A lot of people still think this is about polar bears. And I love polar bears, and I'm very moved to see in the animal videos, really. But people are not gonna lose money for polar bears. Let's be realistic. We have to make it more clear, and this is something I'm still shocked that people don't understand, that this is gonna hurt humans severely. And we have a lot of evidence and a lot of research to show that the impacts on humanity, on the human social system and economic systems are gonna be severe. Trump sadly has overturned the Obama fuel efficiency irrigation last week. I know the timing is just so tragic. Does Israel have a large organized youth climate movement? The US is a growing organization like Sunrise, Earth Guardians. Well, I don't know. I know in the university we have cells of Extinction Rebellion. I heard that the Boy Scout movement, that Sofim are getting into it. but you're right, we need to see more. Where are they? Like, what other issue is bigger now globally and is more pertinent to the young? So maybe we can do something to educate. I don't think they have the right information. I don't think kids get exposed to the correct information about what the climate change story really is. Both BlackRock and JP Chase are part of the $2 billion Keystone bond just greenlighted last week. Yeah, I know. So JP Morgan Chase for sure. BlackRock is making moves. It's not like they moved everything out of investing in that industry, but they are making moves. And you know, it depends on how, you know, you can be cynical, but I think most analysts feel that this is a real move, and that move is just going to intensify. It's really a matter of how much pressure we, the clients, are putting on these investors and that's something we can easily do. I know a friend of mine who works in like economically and socially responsible investment. She's been talking to the pension funds in Israel and they say, we could do it, but there's no interest from the public. So that's what we need to change. We need to make sure that they feel there is interest from the public, and then they'll do it to keep customers. That's why I really feel we should do this. Which are environmentally unfriendly industries rely on the types of investments made from Israel banks and pensions? So that's the thing. We don't even know exactly. We don't even know exactly where. There's been a research effort in the US before that movement started in January. They issued a full report saying which bank, which industry is supporting which industries and how polluting are they. We need something like that in Israel. We need some research to be done in order to tell us where we want to put our money. Do you see any conditionality attached to post-pandemic stimulus recovery in Israel? I haven't heard anything about it. Right, the US 2 trillion, exactly, it doesn't have, because this was a compromise between the Democrats and Republicans not to support neither the fossil fuel industry or the renewable energy industry. Unfortunately, I don't hear anything in the Israeli discussion. It's not even on the table, unfortunately. I don't think we have a lot of people pushing this in the government right now. Maybe if we have a new environment minister, but you know, that's part of the thing. In general, climate change is not sufficiently on the political agenda in Israel. I think we can change that, and we need to change that. But until that happens, it's not going to be on the EU. Absolutely, the EU is doing more. If the whole world was the EU, we would be the climate issue would be in much better shape. Obviously, EU is leading the world in terms of reduction in emission, in terms of legislation, regulation, and so forth. But unfortunately, they represent a rather small share of global emission. In the last few years, high fuel prices made it economically viable, Ari is asking, to focus investment in sustainable. Yeah. It's a good question. But it's also true that this is also a reflection of reduced demand and some political thing between Russia and Saudi Arabia. But the fossil fuel industry is suffering right now. The price correction can relieve some of that, but you know, the fossil fuel industry is suffering right now. The renewable energy is also suffering. Everybody is suffering. But that's why the point about when capital returns there, it should not go to the fossil fuel industry, and this is maybe where we can make a dent. So I think, how can we continue to support? I think from the divestment movement, this is where a lot of us together demanding that kind of investment channel is where we can have an impact. Do you know which of the Israeli banks are giving loans to fossil fuels? No, I'd love to know. I think we should convene a group and start doing some research on this. So in the US, I think it was 350.org, I believe, that did this research, or a climate coalition. And I would like to appeal to the environmental organization in Israel. Everything you're doing is beautiful and it's great, and the campaigns and everything. But I don't think that we're necessarily hitting the right buttons, the most strategic opportunities. And if some of that energy that all the activists in the environmental movement would put together towards doing research on which bank is giving to whom in terms of fossil fuel or renewable energy, it would be a great step forward. So I really would like to call on all the environmental activists in Israel to divert some energy into doing that. I think that can have a much bigger impact than some of the other awareness activities that we are doing. And I would be happy to be part of something like that and advise it, and we could recruit a group that could work on that. I really feel we have an opportunity here, and maybe we can work together to do something around that. Okay. Anything else? Don't get me wrong, like, most of the slides were bad news, but, a lot of bad news, but I'm still feeling by nature optimistic about the whole thing, but we just gotta hit it. We gotta hit it. I'm not optimistic about the pandemic. I don't think it's gonna do much good to the environmental agenda unless we really focus right now intensively on how to avoid that.
So thank you so much, Ram. It was really fascinating, and I really hope we can make the changes that you were talking about and create this kind of movement in Israel as well as in the United States.
Yeah, we can learn from what they did in the States. Maybe we'll start something. Yeah. If you're interested in doing something this together, let me know. Maybe we can put a group together or something. It's not something very hard to do in principle. It just requires some work.
Okay. Thank you again. Thank you again, both Ram and Maya, for this fascinating evening, and thank you for your time. If you want to sum up your lecture in a few words, you can. Maya, if you want to speak now and sum up your lecture in a sentence, so you can do it, and if not, so we can.
I think Maya's last slide was the best summary, I think.
Yes, it really was, and we'll put all the slides in our website. If you guys want to come and join this movement, I encourage you to join our Facebook group. We'll update on new events there. And thank you so much for this evening. It was a pleasure to have all of you here and to hear our speakers.
Thank you so much for having us. Actually, preparing for this made me think about these issues, so I appreciate it, and thank you everybody for making the time and coming to our new virtual space. If anybody is interested in environmental health policy research, you're more than welcome to approach me, and if you want more materials or if I can be of help, please feel free to contact me.
Same here. I'm writing my email now in the...
Okay, so thank you again, everyone, and have a good evening. Thank you for joining us.
Bye, good night.